the salt air used to whisper secrets of forever. Now, it carried the sharp tang of brine and something metallic, like fear. My fingers, sticky with sunscreen, traced the intricate wood grain of the porch railing, worn smooth by years of coastal wind and forgotten promises. Below, the waves hammered the shore, a relentless, indifferent rhythm that suddenly felt like a countdown. A car pulled up the long, winding drive, too fast for this quiet corner of the world. It wasn't his car. A county sheriff's cruiser, glinting in the harsh afternoon sun. Two men in crisp uniforms unfolded themselves, their faces set, their movements precise. They didn't look like they were here for a friendly chat about beach access. One of them held a folded paper. My breath hitched. The paper looked official. Formal. Final. It was addressed to me. My name, stark and cold on the page. And beneath it, an order. Vacate. Immediately. From this house. The house he called ours. My hands started to shake, the salt air suddenly thick and hard to breathe. This wasn't happening. Not here.
Not now.
Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. And if you haven't already, please subscribe, it helps me more than you know. We built this house together, or so I thought. Every plank, every nail, every window overlooking the endless blue. It wasn't just a structure, it was the physical manifestation of a shared dream, a future we painstakingly mapped out on late nights fueled by cheap wine and fierce hope. James had the business acumen, the drive that built an empire from spreadsheets and handshake deals. I had the vision, the eye for turning cold spaces into warm homes, the insistence on details like the specific shade of turquoise for the shutters that mirrored the ocean on a clear day. We were force, everyone said so. The golden couple. Him, sharp suit, sharper mind, effortless charm that could disarm a loan officer or a potential client with a smile. Me, the steady anchor, the creative soul who made his life beautiful outside the sterile glow of office towers. We had the penthouse in the city, the life that screamed success from every polished surface. But this place, the one perched precariously on the cliff edge, was our sanctuary, our secret, where we shed the city skin, and just were. We spent weekends here, then weeks. We talked about retiring here, watching grandchildren dig sandcastles on the beach below. It felt like the one solid, unassailable thing in a world of shifting tides and fleeting fortunes. It was in his name, yes, for tax purposes, he'd said, a casual shrug that I never questioned. Why would I? We were building forever. Our forever was etched into the grain of the wood, painted onto the walls, held in the silence between us as we watched storms roll in from the horizon. The forever shattered on a Tuesday. Not with a bang, but with the quiet, devastating ping of a notification on a burner phone I found tucked away in a drawer I rarely opened, looking for a misplaced passport. It wasn't a phone I recognized. Curiosity, that quiet killer of blissful ignorance, made me pick it up. Texts.
Hundreds of them.
Names I didn't know, plans I wasn't a part of, declarations of love and longing addressed to him. From her. A woman who worked in his office, a junior partner, bright and ambitious, someone I'd met a few times at company events, smiled politely at, never saw as a threat because we were James and I. We were forever. The texts didn't just reveal an affair, they painted a picture of a parallel life he'd been living, meticulously constructed, filled with stolen weekends, whispered endearments, plans for a different future. Our future, it turned out, was just one of his many projects, and it was suddenly clear he'd filed this one under completed and moved on to the next. The air left my lungs. My carefully constructed world imploded silently, leaving behind only the ringing in my ears and the taste of ash. When he came home that night, I was sitting on the edge of the bed, the phone in my hand, the screen a beacon of his betrayal.
He didn't deny it.
Didn't beg. Just looked. Resigned. Almost relieved. Like the weight of his double life had finally been lifted, and now he could simply step into the new one waiting for him. That coldness, that utter lack of remorse for the years, the dreams, the us, was a second, deeper betrayal. The final cut. I told him to leave. To never come back. He packed a bag. And then he dropped the first bomb. The city penthouse, legally, was complicated, tied up in business assets. But the beach house was his.
Solely.
And he wanted me out. Immediately. The first few weeks were a blur of raw pain and disbelieving tears. I stayed at the penthouse initially, the space feeling vast and empty without him, yet suffocating with his ghost in every corner. He stayed away, communicating through frosty lawyers' emails. The beach house became my only focus. Not because of the property itself, not entirely, but because he wanted it. Because he knew how much it meant to me, how it represented the purest part of our failed experiment. And he was using it as leverage, a final twist of the knife. His lawyer's letters were clinical, precise. The deed was solely in James's name. Any money I contributed to renovations or furnishings was a gift or spousal support during the marriage, difficult to recoup. The law, they stated, was clear. He owned it. I had no claim.
They set a deadline.
2 weeks.
Get my things. Be gone.
It felt like a physical blow. Not only had he stolen my past and future, he was trying to steal my sanctuary, the place where the wounds felt slightly less raw, when I could just stare at the ocean. I reached out to lawyers myself. Expensive ones. Recommended ones. They all said variations of the same thing. It's tricky unless you have a written agreement. Marital property division is complex, but this particular asset, the consensus was bleak. Fighting for the beach house specifically would be a long, expensive, and likely losing battle. Focus on other assets, they advised. The sensible, strategic advice felt like abandoning a wounded part of myself. The house wasn't just wood and glass. It was the repository of shared memories of a love that, for a time, felt utterly real. Letting him simply take it felt like letting him erase me from that history entirely. I argued with the lawyers, desperation making me irrational. But we built it together. I poured my heart into it. They listened patiently, professionally, and then reiterated the legal reality. Ownership.
Date.
His name. Their voices were gentle but firm, like doctors delivering a terminal diagnosis. I felt a profound helplessness I hadn't experienced since childhood. My success, my independence, my carefully constructed adult life felt suddenly fragile, easily dismantled by one man's calculated cruelty and a few pieces of paper. He pressed his advantage. Cut off access to joint accounts without warning, leaving me scrambling to cover basic expenses while my own assets were being assessed and tangled up in legal red tape. The lawyers advised patience, negotiation, focusing on a global settlement. But James wasn't negotiating, he was punishing. His moves were designed not just to secure assets, but to inflict maximum pain and humiliation. He changed the locks on the city penthouse before the legal separation was finalized, forcing me to stay in a hotel for a humiliating week before my lawyers could force his hand. He leaked carefully constructed rumors to mutual friends, painting me as unstable, demanding the cause of the marriage's breakdown. Suddenly, phone calls went unanswered. Invitations stopped coming. The social circle we had built together, the one that had celebrated our golden couple status, evaporated, choosing sides with chilling speed. His side, the side with power, money, and a carefully crafted narrative. Every day was a new skirmish in a war I hadn't started and felt ill-equipped to fight. The beach house deadline loomed, a physical representation of his impending victory. I felt trapped, cornered. The waves outside the hotel window mocked me with their freedom, their unstoppable power. I had none. Just a mounting pile of legal bills and a hollow ache where my heart used to be. One night, staring at the ceiling in the impersonal hotel room, scrolling through photos of the beach house on my phone, the deck where we'd had morning coffee, the kitchen island where we'd cooked elaborate meals, the window seat where I'd read for hours, something shifted. The despair was still there, a heavy blanket, but beneath it, an ember flickered. It wasn't about the property anymore. It was about not letting him win. Not letting him walk away having taken everything, the shared life, the future, my reputation, and this final, symbolic piece of our history. The helplessness curdled into a cold, quiet fury. I wasn't the sobbing woman curled on the hotel bed. I was the woman who had helped build an empire, who had a sharp mind of her own, dulled by love and complacency, but not broken. The lawyers had given me the legal limits.
Fine.
I needed to think outside those limits. James had played by the rules of conventional divorce. I needed to find a different game, one he didn't know he was playing. My mind went back to the property itself. The beach house wasn't just a house. It was part of a larger entity, a high-end resort community. There were rules, covenants, an ownership structure that went beyond the individual property lines. James, in his arrogance, had focused only on the deed to the house itself, the structure. But what about the land? The access roads? The utilities? The rules of the resort itself? What if the very act of him trying to forcibly evict me, in the way he was doing it, violated the terms of his presence within the resort? It was a sliver of a thought, a desperate straw to grasp. But it felt like the first real breath I'd taken in weeks. I needed information. Information James wouldn't volunteer, that his lawyers wouldn't think was relevant to a simple property dispute. I started small. Pulled up the resort's public website. Looked for contact information for the homeowners association, the management company. Found names.
Dates.
Corporate structures. It was dry, tedious work, the kind of detail James usually handled, dismissing my interest with a wave of his hand. But now, these dry facts felt charged with potential energy. I remembered snippets of conversations, things James had mentioned casually about the resort's founders, its history, the complex web of ownership and management. He'd always made it sound incredibly complicated, a beast of a system. He loved complexity when he was in control of it. Maybe he'd overlooked a corner of this particular beast. I needed someone who understood the inner workings of this specific place. Not a divorce lawyer. Someone who understood property law, yes, but also the intricacies of large-scale resort development and management. I started asking discreet questions, networking through old contacts who knew people in the real estate development world. I didn't mention James, didn't mention my situation directly. Just hypothetical questions about resort community structures, ground leases, HOA powers, what kind of leverage individual property owners had versus the managing entity. Slowly, a picture began to form. The land under the resort, including the plot our house sat on, wasn't owned outright by the individual homeowners. It was leased long-term from a single entity. The resort management company had unusual power, overseeing everything from maintenance and security to enforcing community bylaws that were stricter and more far-reaching than a typical HOA. There were clauses about conduct, about maintaining the exclusive character of the community, about dispute resolution procedures that must be followed before legal action could be taken. James hadn't followed any of those procedures. He'd gone straight for legal eviction, violating the resort's own rules. This was the key. His ownership of the house might be clear, but his right to occupy or control the land it sat on was subject to the resort's authority. He hadn't just tried to evict me. He had, in his arrogance, potentially put his own standing with the resort at risk. The ember grew warmer. Then came the information that changed everything. Casual mention from an old acquaintance in development circles. Yeah, that resort. It's basically a private kingdom. Been owned by the same group for decades. You know old man Abernathy? He built that whole thing back in the 80s. Still runs the show, quiet as a mouse, Abernathy. The name resonated. Not immediately with the resort, but with something else. My father, Arthur Abernathy. The successful, distant, formidable man I called Dad, but knew primarily through headlines and board meeting summaries. He owned real estate holdings across the country, vast, complex portfolios I rarely paid attention to, my interests lying elsewhere. Could it be that Abernathy? It seemed impossible. He never mentioned this resort specifically. Our conversations were infrequent, polite, skirting the edges of genuine connection. He wasn't involved in my daily life, hadn't been for years, not really. We had a cordial but formal relationship, a byproduct of his demanding career and my own fiercely guarded independence after leaving home. It felt like a long shot, a coincidence based on a common name. But the thought, once planted, grew obsessively. I had to know. This was information I couldn't get through public records easily. This required a direct line. A line I hadn't used for anything significant in years. I stared at his number in my contacts list. My finger hovered over the call button. Calling him felt like admitting defeat, like I was a child again needing rescue. My pride screamed at me. But the image of James's smug face, the cold certainty in his lawyer's eyes, pushed me forward. This wasn't about rescue. It was about leverage. It was about wielding a truth he couldn't conceive of. I took a deep breath, swallowed my pride, and made the call. His assistant answered, coolly professional. I stated my name, prepared for the usual polite brush-off, the scheduling of a call days or weeks later. But then, a pause. One moment, Ms. Abernathy. Mr. Abernathy is free. His voice, when he came on the line, was exactly as I remembered, deep, measured, carrying the weight of command, but with a hint of something softer, surprised perhaps, at hearing from me directly. I didn't waste time on pleasantries. My carefully researched questions tumbled out, framed as a general inquiry about resort property structures, about a hypothetical situation involving a friend. I mentioned the specific resort, the one where the beach house sat.
There was a longer pause this time. That's specific, he said.
Why are you asking about that particular property? My carefully constructed facade crumbled. The desperation, the fear, the raw injustice of it all spilled out. Not just about the house, but about James, the betrayal, the calculated cruelty, the way he was trying to strip everything away. I expected detachment, maybe legal advice. What I got was silence, heavy and considering. Then, very quietly, he said, "Yes, that's my resort. All of it. The land, the management company, the whole damn thing." The ground shifted beneath me. My long shot was the absolute truth. My father owned the entire kingdom. James thought he was merely a subject of. The implications were staggering. My father asked questions then, sharp, incisive, cutting through the emotion to the facts. The divorce proceedings, the beach house deed, James's legal maneuvers, the eviction notice. I answered as clearly as I could, my mind racing, connecting dots I hadn't even seen existed until this moment. When I finished, another silence. "He's trying to evict you from my land," my father stated, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, yet carrying a chilling finality I recognized from his business dealings. "Using a house that sits on property he doesn't own. Under resort bylaws he evidently ignored." The quiet intensity in his voice was more terrifying than any shouting. "He shouldn't have done that. Not on my watch. Not to you." He didn't promise vengeance. He didn't need to. His words were a quiet declaration of war, not for me, but for the violation of his domain, his rules, his family. He told me to stop fighting James's battle the way James wanted me to. To wait. To trust him. He would handle it. He hung up. I stood there, the phone still in my hand, the quiet hotel room spinning. The helplessness was gone, replaced by a dangerous, exhilarating surge of power. The game had changed. And James had absolutely no idea. The next few days were excruciating. I wanted to act, to reveal my hand, to unleash the weapon I now possessed. But my father's instruction had been clear. Wait. He operated on a different timeline, with different tools. While I waited, James continued his assault. The eviction deadline loomed. His lawyer sent increasingly aggressive emails. "Final warning. Legal action will be taken. Sheriff will be instructed." The pressure mounted. Friends, hearing the twisted rumors he'd spread, offered pity or distance. I felt isolated, trapped in the quiet before a storm I knew was coming, but had no control over its timing or its form. I wanted to call James, to tell him what a fool he was, to watch him sweat. But that would ruin it. My father's strategy, I somehow knew, wouldn't be loud or messy. It would be surgical. Precise. Devastating. I focused on enduring, on weathering the final days of his perceived triumph. I packed my belongings from the city penthouse under the cold, watchful eye of movers his lawyer had sent, marking the official separation of our lives. Each box packed felt like bearing another piece of my past. The beach house deadline arrived. I wasn't there. My lawyer advised against it, seeing it as a provocation. James's lawyer confirmed via email that they would be securing the property that day. He was taking possession. He had won this round. The news landed with less impact than it would have before my call to my father. It felt temporary. A placeholder for the inevitable reversal. I spent the day walking, trying to outrun the anxiety, the frustration, the simmering rage. The waiting was the hardest part. The call came 2 days later. Not from my father, but from his chief legal counsel, a man named Mr. Davies, whose voice was as smooth and unyielding as polished granite. He informed me, in clipped, formal tones, of the steps that had been taken. A letter had been delivered to James and his legal team. Not from me, not about the divorce, but from Abernathy Resorts Incorporated, the owner of the land the beach house was built on, the managing entity of the entire resort community. The letter outlined several violations of the resort's bylaws and the ground lease agreement associated with his property. Foremost among them, attempting a summary, unilateral eviction of a legal resident, myself, as a spouse with residency established over years, without following the mandatory resort dispute resolution procedures. Other, smaller violations he'd likely committed over the years, minor structural changes without approval, overdue maintenance fees, James hated paying resort fees, noise complaints the management had filed and he'd ignored, were also listed. The letter stated, clearly and unequivocally, that these violations constituted a breach of his lease agreement and resort standing. As a consequence, Abernathy Resorts Incorporated was exercising its right, per the terms of the ground lease and bylaws he had signed and agreed to terminate his leasehold interest in the land. This didn't mean he lost the house structure itself immediately. That was a separate legal process, but it meant his right to keep the house on the land, or even access the property via resort roads, was now revoked. He had 30 days, the letter stated, to arrange for the removal of his structure from the land. Remove the house. The words echoed in my mind. He couldn't just live in it, couldn't sell it easily with a terminated ground lease. The house structure, valuable on its own, was suddenly sitting on borrowed ground that would soon be denied to him. It was effectively worthless to him as a residence on that spot. Mr. Davies explained the legal reality. James was now facing forced removal of the structure at his own significant expense, or negotiating a distressed sale of the house back to the resort for pennies on the dollar, or finding some improbable way to move a house off a cliffside lot. His attempt to gain sole control of the beach house by evicting me had backfired spectacularly, triggering a chain of events that meant he would lose his right to the land entirely, rendering his ownership of the structure practically moot. He wasn't just losing the house, he was losing the ground beneath it, the access to it, the entire foundation of its value. His cruelty hadn't just been thwarted, it had dismantled his own position entirely. The climax wasn't a single explosive courtroom scene, but a series of quiet, devastating moments over the following weeks, relayed to me by Mr. Davies. James's initial reaction was disbelief. His lawyers, blindsided, scrambled. They argued the resort's actions were retaliatory, an abuse of power. But Abernathy Resorts Incorporated was an ironclad entity, its bylaws and lease agreements written by the sharpest legal minds decades ago, anticipating every possible challenge. They were within their rights. James tried to fight it, filing injunctions. But the resort's legal team, now personally overseen by my father, was relentless, burying him in paperwork, motions, and the cold, hard text of agreements he had signed and disregarded. The pressure on him mounted. His business dealings, already under strain from the divorce, suffered as news of his legal entanglement with a powerful, private resort owner began to circulate in hushed tones among the city's elite. The very ambition and connections he'd used to build his empire and isolate me were now witnessing his downfall. The most satisfying moment, though I wasn't present for it, was described to me by Mr. Davies with a hint of professional satisfaction. It was during a preliminary hearing where James's lawyer was attempting to argue against the lease termination. Mr. Davies, in his calm, precise manner, simply presented the ground lease agreement and the documented violations, then stated the owner's position. James was reportedly sitting beside his lawyer, looking increasingly agitated. At one point, unable to comprehend the totality of the trap that had sprung shut, he reportedly blurted out, "But who even is Abernathy? Who owns this place?" Mr. Davies paused, looked directly at James, and simply said, "My client is Mr. Arthur Abernathy. Perhaps you've heard of him. And this matter," he gestured to the documents, "is being handled at his personal direction." The color drained from James's face. The smug arrogance that had been his default setting for months evaporated, replaced by dawning horror. He reportedly slumped in his chair, completely blindsided. He hadn't just picked a fight with his estranged wife. He had unknowingly picked a fight with her father, a man who owned the very ground James stood on, figuratively and literally. His attempt to weaponize the beach house against me had resulted in him losing his footing entirely within the world he thought he controlled. He hadn't just failed to evict me, he had evicted himself from his own arrogant fantasy. The schadenfreude was a sharp, clean taste on my tongue. It wasn't the emotional, tearful victory I might have once imagined. It was colder, harder, infinitely more satisfying. He hadn't cried when he left me, but he reportedly looked close to it when he realized he'd bet his hand on a game his opponent secretly owned. In the aftermath, the legal battle over the divorce continued, but the dynamic had fundamentally changed. The beach house, once his greatest leverage and my greatest vulnerability, was off the table. Its fate was now a separate matter between James and Abernathy Resorts Incorporated. He eventually sold the house structure to the resort for a fraction of its value, a humiliating capitulation to avoid the nightmare of physically removing it. The money went not to him, but was largely swallowed by legal fees and outstanding resort dues. He lost his sanctuary, his symbol of power, the very asset he had tried to use to crush me. My father didn't gloat. He didn't demand effusive thanks. His involvement was a quiet correction, a reassertion of order within his domain. It was a complex feeling. Gratitude for his intervention, mixed with the long-standing distance between us. It wasn't a storybook reconciliation, but a different kind of understanding. He had protected his own in his own way. The divorce settlement, once a source of terror, became a more level playing field. Without the beach house as his weapon, James was forced to negotiate on more equitable terms regarding the other assets. The process was still painful, tedious, but survivable. I walked away with what was fair, not just the scraps he'd intended to leave me. The relief was immense, a physical weight lifting from my shoulders. I never went back to the beach house. Not during the transition, not after the resort took possession. The salt air still holds too many ghosts. But I drive by sometimes from a distance. It looks different now, absorbed back into the resort's anonymity. It's no longer ours. It's no longer his. It just is. A structure on the coast, stripped of the dreams we built into its frame. The memory of the betrayal still stings, a phantom ache. But it's tempered by the quiet satisfaction of knowing that his cruelty didn't win. That the foundation he thought was so solid crumbled beneath him the moment he tried to use it to destroy me. The Real Foundation, the ground itself, belonged to someone else entirely. Someone who, in the end, was on my side. It was a brutal lesson in power, ownership, and the unseen structures that underpin everything we think we control. I learned that sometimes, the most powerful move is not the one you make yourself, but realizing the true landscape of the game your opponent is playing and finding the leverage points they never saw coming. I lost a marriage, a future, a home built on a lie. But I found my footing again. And I learned that knowing who owns the ground is everything. If this story hit close to home, I'd love to hear your version. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. Thanks for being here. Subscribing helps bring more of these to life.